California has a Transparency Supply Chain Act, UK, France, Australia. Companies have to disclose greenhouse gas emissions, payments to foreign governments. So every company that has to disclose, whether it's a voluntary disclosure, whether it's a disclosure to socially responsible investors, or whether it's to a government, is trying to figure out what is an auditable, transparent, easy way that's cheaper to get this done.
Welcome to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. If you are a developer, an entrepreneur, crypto enthusiast, or just trying to learn more about how distributed ledger technology and Hedera Hashgraph will impact your industry, then you'll love the episodes that we have coming up. Bookmark us, add us to your podcast app, and stay tuned.
Hey there, and welcome to Hedera Hashgraph, Gossip About Gossip. I'm chatting today with the authors of a really interesting and comprehensive overview of the blockchain space. I'm talking today with Professor Marcia Narine Weldon and also my Hedera colleague, Rachel Epstein. Welcome both.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to today's chat. So the paper, as I said, very comprehensive, is called Beyond Bitcoin, Leveraging Blockchain to Benefit Business and Society. That's very aspirational to my mind to describe both the advantages of a blockchain and DLTs in general, I would argue, to both business and society. How did the two of you meet and how did you come to write this paper? Marcia, perhaps you first.
Sure. So before I became an academic, I came from the supply chain background. I've been a deputy general counsel, a chief compliance officer, chief privacy officer for a company that managed other companies' supply chains, and had also been an outside lawyer. And I decided to go into academia, where you have to publish long, boring articles that no one reads and nobody cares about, which I thought was really difficult for me. So everything that I've written has been something related to compliance or corporate governance or business and human rights. And so I started learning about blockchain and DLT relatively late, probably early for lawyers because lawyers tend to be behind on most things, but relatively late for the rest of the world. And I found that it was a perfect marriage of blockchain and human rights and business and disclosure. And I figured this could make something work. A theme that runs through all of the things that I work on has been disclosure. How do we make sure the processes work? How do we ensure accuracy, transparency, reliability, and minimize fraud? In other aspects, so blockchain just seemed to work. I've never focused on the cryptocurrency side, but I was reading everything I could on DLT and blockchain in general. And coincidentally, I had been reading a book that Rachel researched and edited called Blockchain the Law as I was on the way to a conference in New York on humanitarian uses of blockchain. I met her there, talked to her about helping me co-author to really add the real world context. Even though I still consult and work with real clients, most of them are not thinking about blockchain. So I needed to have the real world context to marry my supply chain knowledge with the DLT knowledge.
I definitely want to come back to disclosure because that seems to me a key component of the paper. Rachel, how about yourself?
I have much farther less experience as a lawyer. I had only, recently graduated law school a few years prior, but my focus had been in the startup scene, tech law, IP background. Yes, I agree with Marcia that lawyers are a little behind usually, especially when it comes to tech advancements, even when they're affecting the law. But I was fortunate enough to kind of stumble into blockchain, really just happen chance. I heard about it living in Israel and, being in the tech world, but it didn't really directly come into my everyday life until I started researching the book by Professor Wright. He was a professor of mine, Professor Aaron Wright at Cardozo School of Law. And it was a wonderful opportunity for almost a year. I was, just submerged in this technology. And I think what really clicked with when I met Professor Weldon is that we both didn't have the focus on the cryptocurrency aspect, but the underlying technology. Not once I think that either of us mentioned tokens until we were explaining tokens in the article. So that was unique. That's usually the hype that people tend to start talking about first. And so, I started working on the book. The book led me to take the initiative to write my own articles and my own ideas that I published in New York State Bar Magazine and other smaller publications. And then when I was at the Humanitarian Blockchain Conference, I ran into Professor Weldon and had a wonderful conversation. She told me the article she was writing about, which I must admit I knew very little about. And to me, it was just more learning. What I could bring was, the more, I guess, technical side, which is very weird for me to say as someone who never took a computer science class and can maybe write a few lines in basic Java. But I wanted to understand the technology as best I could. So I could, bring that, and also just the limited experience I had working in-house at a fairly large company at the time, working in this space called Consensus, and what we were doing, and what that could add to the article in terms of real world use cases and knowledge.
I just want to add one thing. One of the things that was really hard when I was researching on this area is that stuff was way too advanced for the average reader or way too theoretical. And so what Rachel really helped with was trying to elevate it to make sure that I wasn't wrong on anything, and also keeping it accessible. And so, the hope is that a person who doesn't really know anything about blockchain, but is interested in the space, but doesn't really care about cryptocurrency, can come away with having some level of knowledge and feel somewhat comfortable with the vocabulary. Because it was hard for me to find anything like that when I was doing the research. So I think that's what I'm most proud of with our article.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I would have appreciated having your article around, say 2.5 years ago when I joined the space, right? Because, lots of existing content just makes assumptions about what people know and where their starting points is.
There's so many articles I read, and they don't even explain what a node is.
Right.
And you're just starting to read this article that's getting into all these, complex, issues of, disclosure regimes and this and that and jurisprudence but they're talking about blockchain and peer-to-peer and using all these buzzwords, and they mention nodes, which are so important. And there's definitely a few articles I've read would never even thought to mention, like, oh, hey, by the way, guys, so what a node is just computer server, the computing power, that you need. It's just the server on the network. I was always amused by that.
Right. And the idea that there are multiple nodes is sort of central to the whole value proposition. Marcia, you're on the faculty at the University of Miami, are you now? Not?
Correct. Yes, I am.
I think I watched a presentation where you were arguing that students needed to be taught about blockchain and particularly smart contracts. Is that happening now for law students?
It definitely is. I don't teach on blockchain or smart contracts now. There are some adjunct faculty members who do. For your listeners who may not know the difference, adjunct faculty members aren't typically a full-time law professor. They're typically practicing lawyers. And because there's so few faculty members that have actually had practical experience, that's not research, it's not a surprise. But there are a number of law schools that are adding more blockchain curricula. University of New Hampshire has an online certification. A number of professors have become really active in the space. And I think that's good, because what concerns me the most is that there's a lot of legislation that's coming out that may or may not make a whole lot of sense from a practical perspective. So you have legislative aides that are drafting legislation that don't understand it, don't understand the tech side. And so that will, when there's litigation or whether there's judicial opinions come out, that's going to complicate things. So to the extent that you have students now learning about what blockchain is, what smart contracts are, what coding is, and then my school, we have a coding for lawyers class, which the students freak out about. But it's helpful because if you're going to be dealing with smart contracts, understanding what coding can only help. So because they're going to be the future legislative aides, the future judicial law clerks, they're going to be helping the more seasoned lawyers understand this technology.
Oh, I just want to add one thing, just the importance of the education for law students. And, I sadly missed the boat. It started happening at schools after my time. But, there's a new field emerging called legal engineers. Coding for lawyers is becoming so important. And I foresee a path in this area taking on more of a shape kind of like patent lawyers in the US, where to become a patent attorney, to actually litigate patents, you need to pass the patent bar. And in order to take the patent bar, you need to have a hard science and math background. And I foresee something of that sort possibly evolving in this field where, you need to have some coding experience, whether it's a boot camp or a full-on computer science degree to, maybe become a legal engineer where you're going to be able to write the smart contracts, deploy them. And if it's, more and more states say they are enforceable, litigate them and whatnot. So I think there's a huge potential in this field and more jobs that will open as long as students have a really fundamental understanding.
Do you think current students have, that hybrid set of skills, or will they necessarily develop them?
I think they want jobs and they will do what it takes to get jobs. And this is a really fascinating field. Not to put tax law down, I have many friends in it, but I would take a coding class and learn this to be in this field as opposed to studying the tax code. But that's just me. I think it's just new and innovative and exciting, and people will do what it takes to make sure that they're employed and paying back law school debt.
Can't argue with that logic. I often see, the blockchain space praised or perhaps just commented on as requiring this sort of intersection of skills, understanding economics, understanding tech, and now understanding legal issues too with smart contracts. Fascinating. So we've talked about smart contracts, but sort of famously in the industry, they're neither smart nor perhaps contracts. You can tell me whether or not they satisfy the criteria of actually being a meaningful legal contract. So what's the value? What are they providing us here?
I just have to say, I think it's great. I've read many times how Vitalik has often said he regrets naming them smart contracts and really wished he named them more accurately persistent scripts. I still think smart contracts have a value proposition, whether you define them, as decentralized, self-executing, pre-programmed contracts, and, what your definition of a contract is, or persistent scripted language that's overlaid on the blockchain and enables transactions on the blockchain to mirror real life contracts by attaching if-then conditions in the code. But at the end of the day, contracts are very important to everyday life. Societies are, built on them, daily interaction. So I think if we have these new elevated versions of contracts or way of transacting that arguably is, automated, more reliable, since there's no centralized point of attack, hence the whole decentralized nature and autonomous nature, more secure and tamper-proof and efficient without a middleman. There are these advantages to this smart contract, this new way of transacting that, that is providing more for less of a cost. So to me, there is a value proposition. I think how it's going to be used, in what use cases, that's going to evolve as the technology, still evolving, scales, and is, implemented more. But definitely, for value transfer, rules-based value transactions in, financial agreements, trade finance, insurance, derivatives, we're already starting to see this is, having an impact. So I'm still excited about it, despite the misnomer and whatnot.
So, Rachel, the disintermediation that you describe, that's sort of inherent to DLTs. But historically, it's been lawyers that have interpreted and created and managed contracts. Have you not just talked lawyers out of a job? If smart contracts can automate the processing of legal terms, et cetera, what's left for lawyers?
So I think what I did, like what I mentioned earlier, the actual programming of the contracts could still be done by lawyers. That legal engineers, that hybrid new field, I think we're going to see greater need for it. And I also believe that this is not going to eliminate lawyers. The terms still need to be negotiated. There's so many other factors, regulatory and, nuances to deal with. I think what's interesting is we're looking at traditional contracts, which are often called like probabilistic, versus what you hear all the time around smart contracts as being highly deterministic. So to me, that means guaranteed payment versus probable payment. It's that, removal of that human error or those, power plays like all the terms are agreed upon, but I lost internet access or can't get to a computer right now or fax machine to sign the document. So you're not going to actually get paid on time because I can't execute it. So who knows, maybe in 50 years, it'll be a different story. But, by then, aliens will native technology is, going to rebel and AI is going to take over. So who knows?
What a very optimistic worldview, Rachel.
Well, good thing I'll be dead by then. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah. It's just the pros outweigh the cons. And if we're looking at, overall social good, which a lot of this, article is about, we're talking about, financial inclusion, transparency, protecting the people with providing them information and access. A huge barrier to the legal system is, the ability to pay for a lawyer. And smart contracts could help that if it decreases costs and, makes it more efficient to have these contracts that are automated and trusting a single source of truth.
Marcia, any thoughts? Contracts,
and
smart or otherwise?
I think it actually goes back to the question you asked before about what students should learn and why. It goes directly to the issue that Rachel just mentioned. Whether it's escrow contracts, insurance contracts, funds transfers, those kinds of things. But lawyers aren't going to be out of a job because someone has to help with how this gets coded. But you have to really understand how contracts work, just regular contracts work. So, for example, I just finished grading 17 contracts for my transactional drafting class. And there's a huge escrow part. And if there are pages and pages in this contract about what happens if certain conditions aren't or are not met. What happens to the interest, what happens to the escrow amount, what happens to the principal. Does it go back to the buyer? Does it go to the seller? When does it go? What part goes? And so there's pages and pages. And at some point that's going to be automated. But if the lawyer gets that part wrong, the money goes to the wrong person at the wrong time. So there's pros and cons, but there's a lot that can be done that can be helpful. But even to add some complexity, in a traditional contract dispute, a judge is going to look at the meeting of the minds. That's what every first-year contract student learns. So what were the parties thinking? Well, how do you do that when it comes to a smart contract? There's not a traditional governance structure that you'd have to figure one out. So what if there's a coding error? What does the judge do with that kind of a thing? So do you have a kill function for certain kinds of situations? And again, you have a number of states, Tennessee, Arizona, Wyoming, Nevada, Ohio, that have passed legislation about the enforceability of smart contracts. But it remains to be seen how courts are going to deal with this. And then you've got things like alternative dispute resolution. So in April, I'm speaking on a panel at the ABA, the American Bar Association, about ADR and smart contracts. So this is a very underdeveloped but a very fertile area of the law right now.
Yeah, you talked about errors, bugs, et cetera, in the smart contract. I think people are waking up more and more to the difficulties of reconciling human frailties in coding and immutability of contracts, right? And the presumption that you write a smart contract to a ledger and that's it, right? You can't edit it, notwithstanding the reality that it probably does have errors or bugs. So yeah, we're learning. Marcia, Rachel mentioned social good, and that's a key piece of the paper, the potential value of blockchain, et cetera, to enabling some social good for hopefully a wide swath of society. One key component or one key use case within that bucket, if you will, I see more and more being identity and decentralized identity, the proposition that to some extent anchoring identities in a blockchain will provide some value to people who perhaps don't have identities now or have identities, but they're being unfairly treated. Do you have any thoughts on that value?
You have, over 1 billion people in the world that can't prove their identity. And you have millions of children that are being born without proof of who they are. And when you don't have a way to prove who you are, that means you may not be able to get benefits. You may not be able to get services from the state. You may not be able to get your inheritance if there is such a thing. So, and I think about it in the context of the migration crisis, where you have situations where you have millions of people going from one place to the next. And that's part of the reason that the United Nations has so many blockchain or DLT projects going on right now. And some of them deal with this. self-sovereign identity issue, because how do you know to whom you're giving the aid if that's the actual person? How do you eliminate fraud? How do you ensure that the person that needs to get the aid actually gets the aid? So in the context of being able to prove who you are, that also goes to other areas in terms of land rights, for example. In many countries in the world, you have land grabs because people can't prove who they are. They can't prove that they own the property. So, without getting into a whole lot more detail, which I'm happy to do later, there's so many areas where from the time that you're born to the time that you get married, to the time that you need to prove your health benefits, the time you need to prove what your education is, that you own land, that you are the child of such and such. All of those are areas where having a decentralized ledger with proof of identity is important. Also in the context of being able to say, I want you to know just this little bit of information to have this transaction done, but no more, because you have to worry about things about identity theft and privacy and those kinds of things as well.
Yeah. You cited, the migration use case of people dispossessed from their property. It's often cited as the value of something like Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency, for them to be able to take it with them, but just as critically, take their identity with them as well and not be beholden to some authority. Rachel, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think decentralized identity not only addresses financial inclusion, social good, but just as you kind of touched on, data portability and identity management are really important in more than just the social good and financial inclusion aspects. All about, right now, this is, I think, it's a very hot topic with huge companies in the news for profiting off of their users' data, and how much identity theft is just rampant in the States. And this is a way of kind of putting the power back into the hands of the users, since it is their information, and, giving them enabling them to decide, how do I want to manage my information? Who should have access to the data? And maybe even for what price? Monetization of the data by the user instead of the company is, something that's being explored. And it just makes me think of, the old saying, like, information is power, very much so in this case, leading to less fraud, identity theft. There's still this, fundamental issue, and why I'm just a little more skeptical, even though I love this, whether you call it a use case because you're simply using it for identity, verification and credentials. This is who I am, so I can go on my flight, or I can pay my bill, or, whatnot, as opposed to enabling other use cases, as, Marcia mentioned, with voting or land registration, know your customer, KYC, regulatory compliance. This is, potentially going to have a huge impact, helping comply with GDPR and other data, protection laws.
Such as the new California Privacy Act that came out back on January 1st, which is like a mini GDPR, but in some ways more complicated.
Yep. And that's why, on December 30th and 31st, everyone got their updated terms and privacy policies from all their favorite companies. Yeah. So I think there's great potential. But yeah, again, like I said, the reason I'm, not like so gung-ho about this is it's still very early days. I've yet to seen it really proven. While I know many companies are really working on this, it's, still, nascent technology, nascent use case. And when it comes to the social good aspect, there, I have so many hesitations about someone who, in a third world country that, has issue having, access to internet, but is going to rely on, decentralized identity as their form of identification, or doesn't have a birth certificate. It's more of a systemic public state actor issue that, still needs to be solved for the technology to really be implemented and utilized to have as much value as it can. But that doesn't mean I'm not hopeful. I really am. I think this could be amazing.
I agree. I think skepticism is good. I come from an identity management background, so I've been skeptical of the value proposition of decentralized identity or self-sovereign for a long time. But yeah, I've convinced myself of the value fundamentally, almost mundanely, of removing from the real-time participation of the Facebooks and the Googles and the current identity providers that sort of mediate our interactions with the online world we deal with. And that has privacy advantages.
Absolutely. But I think what I'm getting at is, you still need identifiers for them to be then verified identifiers on the blockchain. So if you don't have the physical identifier, it's very hard to then make that jump to the verified blockchain identifier. And also, like Marcia mentioned very wisely about smart contracts and, how recent legislation is getting passed to show that they are enforceable. But, there is still uncertainty in many states and in many countries. And the world of decentralized identity is even further behind. There's a complete absence of legal precedent. So the degree of risk and uncertainty, and us lawyers, of course, will focus on potential unbounded liability by agreeing to participate in an identity ecosystem is very high. And so I think we need to see more use case and, implementation, more POCs, proof of concepts, more beta testing, more governments getting involved. Hopefully the law will then catch up.
So the other aspect, the other half perhaps of the paper is less about social good and more about business. And the archetypical use case for DLTs applied to business is supply chain. Marcia, you said you came from supply chain. Where do you see the fit?
I see this a fit in terms of, it could take hundreds of sheets of paper or steps to be able to track something from the time, let's take your coffee table. There's a tree in Indonesia. From the time it gets from the tree in Indonesia to Pier 1 imports in your local mall, there's a number of steps, customs agents, all kinds of different kinds of shipping clerks. And it's all prone to error, duplication, fraud, mismanagement, and time. And so anything that you can do to make something more open and transparent is going to be better. But there's supply chains in a number of areas. So for example, there's food supply chains. So you may have heard, last year, Walmart announced that its suppliers of green leafy vegetables had to be on the blockchain. That's really important because it could take weeks to figure out if there's a food problem, a food safety issue. As you know, every other month there's a problem with lettuce, whether it's E. coli or salmonella. Once there's a recall, every lettuce producer in the country has to shut down. That means small farmers lose money. That means Walmart, McDonald's, the restaurants, schools can't use lettuce. Now, with the traceability perspective in the supply chain, you can cut that down to seconds or minutes, finding out where that lettuce came. That's why in the ag tech, agricultural technology, they're really looking at blockchain for how do we figure out where the wheat's coming from, what shipment has it gone on, what fertilizer was used. All of those are critical. So they not only help in terms of speeding up the supply chain and in terms of saving money, but they also help in terms of public health, which is why you find the FDA and others looking at it as well. So, for example, there's food traceability laws that are going into effect where companies are starting to think about blockchain. There's medical context in the supply chain. There's so much fraud and counterfeiting in medicine. So drug companies and drug agencies are looking about, should we use blockchain to be able to track and trace those kinds of things as well. So, but you have your first mile and you have your last mile problem. Your first mile problem is what Rachel talked about a minute ago. You got to make sure that the information is correct when it goes in. And then your last mile is making sure the information is correct at the end stage.
You mentioned medical. I've had really interesting discussions with a customer of Hedera in the pharma space. And for them, supply chain, it's all the normal concerns or risks that you cited. But if you're shipping drugs, then it's the temperature provenance, if you will, of those drugs over that supply chain that is critical. Because I guess if a drug goes above a certain temperature, then it might be compromised. And so for this pharma customer, right, it was the ability to know through trusted smart temperature sensors, reporting the current temperature to a ledger, where, as you describe it, it's available for all to see and the normal guarantees of integrity.
Exactly. Because it for some people, it literally could be a matter of life and death. But from a business perspective, companies have to be able to have a reliable solution to accurately track their supply chains by 2023 in the drug area. So I can see why this would make a complete business sense for them as well. But also, again, from the human health side, up to 1 million people are killed every year worldwide because of recall management problems. And better tracking through the supply chain would help there as well.
I thought it was interesting that the lettuce example you cited. What I heard was that if the real cause of the outbreak were identifiable through a ledger, then other producers, other lettuce farmers wouldn't need be compromised or impacted.
Exactly. Yeah, we think of big, huge farms, but there's a lot of family farmers all over the world that have to shut down what they're doing until somebody figures out where the source of the contaminated lettuce comes from. So you really are affecting more than just big companies. You're affecting, families and what they need to do as well.
Yeah, indeed. So the last significant piece of the paper, Beyond Bitcoin paper, is about disclosure. Marcia, do I understand the value proposition that disclosure is, in a sort of a loose sense, some commitment or a statement a company makes that they're required to make, and that the value proposition is by having them make that assertion, put it on the ledger, quote unquote, timestamp it, then they are less likely to make false statements? Is that what we're trying to accomplish?
Somewhat. I mean, if you are a public company or a company that's going public, you need to disclose to the regulators as well as potential investors a number of things about your processes. So it's no surprise that the SEC is training its investigators on blockchain, and not just because of cryptocurrency fraud. Internal auditors are doing pilot programs with national governments about using blockchain for auditing processes. It makes it much faster. I also look at blockchain, though, in disclosure, because there's a number of SEC and other regulatory disclosures that have a human rights component. So when Rachel talked about mineral rights, so if you list your stock on a U.S. exchange, you're required to disclose whether any of your minerals came from the Democratic Republic of Congo or 9 surrounding countries. You're talking about artisanal miners, which are people who are using shovels and pickaxes to get gold out of a river or to get tin out of a mine. And from that mine to the time it ends up in a Ford automobile, you've got to say, I know where that came from. And right now it's rife with corruption, with fraud, and it's very expensive and time consuming. And many companies say they can't tell you where it's coming from. So they're looking at it for that. You've got the diamonds. If you've gone into a diamond store, you may see it's a conflict-free diamond. There's a process called the Kimberley process. So De Beers and other companies are looking at using blockchain to be able to do that. The EU has disclosure regulation that doesn't just look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. Any place where there's a conflict zone or used to be a conflict. That could be Colombia with the FARC rebels. It can be any place. You've got to disclose, where did your minerals come from? California has a Transparency Supply Chain Act. UK, France, Australia. Companies have to disclose greenhouse gas emissions, payments to foreign governments. So every company that has to disclose, whether it's a voluntary disclosure, whether it's a disclosure to socially responsible investors, or whether it's to a government, is trying to figure out what is an auditable, transparent, easy way that's cheaper to get this done. And it has real world implications, even outside of government. So I talked about minerals in Africa. There's another mineral called cobalt, where Congo has 65% of the cobalt in the world. That's in your cell phone. That's in your electric cars. That's in your computers. 2 weeks ago, an NGO sued Apple, Tesla, Alphabet, and Microsoft because they're saying they're complicit in the child deaths in the cobalt mines. So Apple and others have to be able to say, where are they getting their cobalt from? Because they're going to have to answer to this. So again, there's companies like Trafigura and others that are looking at using blockchain, Ford, BMW, etc., looking at being able to track and trace where everything comes from. Number one, so they can answer the regulators, and number two, so they can deal with potential litigation. And then finally, I'll say, if you don't care about human rights, I'm not here to judge, but if you care about the bottom line in litigation, there are companies getting sued for false and deceptive trade practices because they say they care about child labor, they care about the environment, etc. But there are Thai slaves in Thailand that are catching fish that are going into fancy feast cat food. So you're finding companies are getting Nestle, others are getting sued. So now blockchain is being used in Thailand in the aquaculture area to be able to say, from the time we catch the fish, the time it ends up in the cat food, we're going to tell you where the fish came from. Again, garbage in, garbage out. That's going to be the problem that you have to worry about. But throughout the world, the disclosure regime is huge, whether it's for consumers who want to know that their products are ethically sourced, or whether it's the government that says, tell me how many greenhouse gas emissions you've done because you're looking at a carbon tax. The potential is huge.
Yeah, as you say, bottom line for those large enterprises is how do they prove to some extent that they've not taken cobalt from a particular mine?
And when you're dealing with these countries, or you're dealing with all of these places, almost every place that your resources are mined, whether it's timber, minerals, etc., you're potentially dealing with kleptocracies or corrupt governments. You're dealing with the armed rebels, etc. And again, that's why that transparency aspect and the immutability aspect of the blockchain is particularly attractive. And that's why, the Secretary General of the United Nations last week said, we got to focus more on blockchain. That's why there's dozens of blockchain projects in public and private partnerships around the world, because you're dealing with places where you can't trust the government. And so my understanding of blockchain is that it helps when you have those trust issues. Of course, you have to have the infrastructure to do it, which is a whole other thing.
At the end of the day, blockchain is about, to some extent, redistributing trust and de-emphasizing the need to trust particular entities and share that out. Marcia, Rachel, I fear we've only scratched the surface of this paper. Incredibly detailed, incredibly comprehensive. I will definitely add links in the podcast notes. But thank you very much for scratching that surface with me, if you will. This has been a great conversation.
And thanks for having me. And thanks again, Rachel, for really making this the article that it came out to be. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. This has been such a wonderful learning opportunity for me. And that's why I'm also so attracted to this field. Other smart people working on really hard issues, constantly being challenged.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. If you liked the episode, please subscribe, rate and review, and also share and tell your friends.
Or connect with us on social media like Twitter, Instagram, etc. at Hashgraph, particularly if you want to leave us feedback on the podcast. We look forward to hearing from you.